Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to another journey through the corridors of time, another evening spent exploring the mysteries that have captivated human imagination for thousands of years. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most enduring legends ever told, a story that has inspired countless expeditions, sparked fierce debates, and captured the dreams of explorers, scholars, and dreamers alike. Tonight, we're exploring Atlantis. But this isn't just another retelling of a lost civilization beneath the waves. This is the true history of Atlantis, which means we're going to explore not just the legend itself, but where it came from, why it was created, and how a story written by one philosopher in ancient Athens became one of the most powerful myths in human history. We'll journey through Bronze Age palaces, volcanic eruptions, pseudo-scientific theories, and underwater explorations. We'll meet Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, 19th century politicians, and modern archaeologists. And by the end, you'll understand not just what Atlantis was, but what it means, and why, after more than 2,000 years, we still can't stop talking about it. So settle in, get comfortable, let the world around you fade into softness as we begin our journey back through time, back to an evening in Athens, back to the moment when one of history's greatest stories was born. The birth of a legend. Picture Athens in the year 360 before the Common Era. The city is already ancient by its own standards, having existed for centuries, its democracy having risen and fallen and risen again. The Parthenon, that magnificent temple to Athena that still stands today, though weathered and worn, has been standing for over 70 years. The great age of Athens, the time of Pericles, has passed. The city has fought and lost the devastating Peloponnesian War against Sparta. The world feels older, more complicated, less certain than it did in the golden days. In this city, in this moment of reflection and uncertainty, lives a man named Aristocles, though history knows him by his nickname, Plato, or so some ancient sources suggest. He's in his late 60s, approaching 70, which in the ancient world makes him an elder, a man who has seen much and thought deeply about what he's witnessed. He's already written many of his famous dialogues, those philosophical works written as conversations between his teacher, Socrates, and various other characters. He's established his academy, one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western world, where young men come to learn philosophy, mathematics, and the art of thinking clearly about the world. Plato has spent his life thinking about justice, about the ideal society, about how human beings should organize themselves to live good and meaningful lives. He's written The Republic, his masterwork, describing an ideal city-state, governed by philosopher kings, where everyone has their proper place and performs their proper function.
But describing an ideal is one thing. Showing it in action, demonstrating how it might actually work in the real world, that's another matter entirely. So Plato begins working on a new dialogue, actually a trilogy of connected works. The first will be called Timaeus, the second Critias, and the third was meant to be Hermocrates, though that final dialogue was never completed. In these works, Plato plans to show his ideal society not just as an abstract concept, but as a historical reality, a real place that once existed and proved itself in the crucible of actual events. And to do this, Plato is about to tell a story that will echo through the millennia. He's about to describe a mighty island nation, technologically advanced, incredibly powerful, blessed by the gods themselves. He's going to describe its gleaming cities, its sophisticated culture, its vast armies and navies. And then he's going to destroy it, plunging it beneath the waves in a single day and night of misfortune. He's going to create Atlantis. But here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. Plato doesn't present this as a myth or a fable or an allegory. He has his characters insist repeatedly that this story is absolutely true. It's not a philosophical thought experiment. It's history, passed down through generations from ancient Egypt to Athens, preserved by priests and told to the wise lawmaker Solon, who carried it back to Greece, where it was preserved in the memory of certain noble families. True history. Actual events. Real places, real people, real catastrophes. Why would Plato do this? Why would one of history's greatest philosophers, a man devoted to truth and clarity of thought, present a fictional story as historical fact? That question has puzzled scholars for more than 2,000 years, and we'll explore it deeply as we continue. But for now, let's enter that philosophical dinner party in ancient Athens and hear the story exactly as Plato told it. Plato's account, the original story. The story of Atlantis appears in two of Plato's dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. These were written as conversations between several characters, including Socrates himself, gathered together to discuss philosophy and history. The setting is intimate, a small group of educated men talking over the course of an afternoon and evening, the kind of intellectual gathering that was common in ancient Athens among the upper classes. The dialogue begins with Socrates asking if anyone knows a story that might illustrate the principles of the ideal state he had described the previous day. A character named Critias responds that he knows just such a story, one he heard from his grandfather, who heard it from his own grandfather, who heard it from the great Athenian lawmaker Solon, who carried it back to Greece where it was preserved in the memory of certain noble families.
Plato is establishing credibility, creating a lineage of reliable sources stretching back to Egypt, a civilization that even to the ancient Greeks represented profound antiquity and wisdom. The Egyptians, after all, had been recording their history for thousands of years. They had written records, priesthoods devoted to maintaining knowledge, a continuity of culture that the Greeks could only marvel at. According to the story Critias tells, Solon had travelled to Egypt, to the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, around 590 before the Common Era. While there, he spoke with the priests at the temple of Neith, and being Solon, being curious and educated, he began telling them about Greek history and mythology. He spoke of Deucalion's flood, of ancient heroes, of the oldest Greek traditions. The Egyptian priests listened politely, and then one of them, an old man, very ancient and very wise, essentially told Solon something remarkable. He said that the Greeks were like children. They had no deep knowledge of the past. Their traditions went back only a few generations. Every few thousand years, you see, according to this priest, catastrophes overtake the world. Great floods, devastating fires, earthquakes and disasters that wipe out civilizations and force survivors to start over from scratch. The Greeks had suffered many such catastrophes, which is why their traditions were so young, so shallow. But Egypt, situated as it is in a geography protected from the worst of these cyclical disasters, had maintained its records through many such cataclysms, and in those records, preserved in the temple archives, written on ancient pillars and scrolls, there were stories of peoples and places that had vanished thousands of years before, long before the Greeks even existed as a distinct people. And one of these stories, the priest told Solon, concerned Athens itself. Not the Athens of Solon's time, not even the Athens of 1,000 years before, but an Athens that existed 9,000 years in the past, a city so ancient that the Athens Solon knew was merely its distant descendant, its memory preserved only in Egypt because the Athenians themselves had forgotten their own history. This ancient Athens, according to the Egyptian records, had been the greatest city-state in the world. It was organized according to principles of justice and wisdom. Its warriors were the finest, its citizens the most virtuous, and this ancient Athens had faced a threat so great that it had tested them to their very limits. For in those distant times there existed a vast island located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, which we know today as the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow waterway that separates the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. This island was called Atlantis, named after Atlas, the oldest son of its founder, Poseidon himself, god of the sea.
Atlantis was enormous, larger than Libya and Asia combined, Plato tells us.
To put that in perspective, in ancient Greek geography, Libya referred to North Africa west of Egypt, and Asia referred to what we'd call Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. So we're talking about an island the size of a small continent, a massive landmass sitting in the Atlantic Ocean. This island was blessed by the gods. Poseidon had fallen in love with a mortal woman named Clito, whose parents had been among the first inhabitants of Atlantis. To protect his beloved, Poseidon shaped the landscape of the island's central region into a series of alternating rings, circles of land and water, each ring separated from the next by channels wide enough for ships to pass through. In the very center, on a hill, he built a palace for Clito, and there they had 10 sons, 5 pairs of twins. The oldest of these sons was named Atlas, and to him Poseidon gave sovereignty over the entire island and the surrounding ocean. To the others, he gave different regions to rule, establishing a confederation of 10 kingdoms, all under Atlas's supreme authority. And Atlas had many children, and his children had children, and so the royal line continued, generation after generation, maintaining the power and wisdom that Poseidon had bestowed upon them. The Atlanteans, according to Plato, were blessed not only with divine heritage, but with abundant natural resources. The island produced everything its people could need: rich soil, perfect for agriculture, forests full of timber, mountains containing precious metals, including gold, silver, copper, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, which Plato describes as shining like fire and being more valuable than anything except gold itself. What orichalcum actually was, if it was anything real at all, nobody knows. Some have suggested it might have been an alloy of copper and gold, or perhaps brass, or maybe just a mythical substance Plato invented. But in his description, it covered the walls of Atlantean buildings, gleaming in the sunlight, making their cities shimmer with otherworldly beauty. The capital city of Atlantis, built around that original hill where Poseidon had made his home with Clito, was a marvel of engineering and urban planning. The alternating rings of land and water that Poseidon had created were still there, but the Atlanteans had enhanced them, building massive bridges across water channels and digging a great canal from the outermost ring all the way to the sea, allowing ships to sail from the ocean right into the heart of the city. The outermost ring of land was wide enough for a racetrack where horses could run. On each ring of land, the Atlanteans built temples, gardens, gymnasiums, and barracks for their soldiers. They constructed walls around each ring, covering them with different metals that gleamed in the sun. The outermost wall was covered in brass, the middle wall in tin, and the innermost wall surrounding the very center of the city in orichalcum that flashed with fiery brilliance.
In the very center, on that original hill, stood a temple to Poseidon that exceeded all others in size and beauty. The outside was covered in silver, the roof in gold. Inside stood a massive statue of Poseidon himself, depicted standing in a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses so tall that his head touched the temple ceiling. Around him stood statues of the 100 Nereids, sea nymphs who served him, riding on dolphins. The wealth of Atlantis was beyond imagining. The kings lived in palaces that rivaled the temple in splendor. There were hot springs and cold springs, both flowing with abundant water, and the Atlanteans had built elaborate systems to bring this water everywhere it was needed, to their baths, to their gardens, even to their racetracks where trees grew alongside the running paths, providing shade. They built harbors full of triremes, those sleek warships that dominated ancient naval warfare. They trained armies of thousands upon thousands of soldiers, charioteers, archers, slingers, and sailors. But Atlantis was not just one island.
Beyond the rings of the capital city, beyond the mountains and plains and forests of the main island, the Atlanteans controlled many other islands. They had colonies and trading posts throughout the Atlantic. They even controlled territory on the continents beyond, parts of what we might call Europe and Africa, extending their power right up to Egypt on one side and inland to central Italy on the other. For many generations, according to Plato, the Atlanteans were noble and virtuous. They inherited divine nature from their ancestor Poseidon, and this divine nature kept them wise and moderate. They valued friendship and virtue more than wealth, even though they had more wealth than any nation had ever possessed. They lived in harmony with each other and with the natural world, grateful for their blessings, mindful of their responsibilities. But as the generations passed, as the divine blood became diluted with mortal blood through intermarriage and time, the Atlanteans began to change. Their divine nature began to fade. Human nature, with all its weaknesses and appetites, began to dominate. They became ambitious, greedy, hungry for more power, more territory, more control. They were no longer satisfied with their island paradise and their trading empire. They wanted to conquer the world. So the kings of Atlantis assembled their forces and launched a massive military campaign. They sent their armies and navies across the Mediterranean, conquering and subjugating peoples as they went. They took control of Libya up to the borders of Egypt. They conquered parts of Europe up to what is now Italy. They were poised to sweep through the entire Mediterranean world, enslaving all the peoples they encountered. But they had not counted on one obstacle. One city-state stood against them and refused to bow. One people had the courage and skill to resist.
That city-state was Athens, ancient Athens, the one from 9,000 years in the past. The Athens that had organized itself according to principles of justice and wisdom, whose citizens were raised to be virtuous and whose warriors were trained to be excellent. The war was terrible. Many of Athens' allies, seeing the overwhelming power of Atlantis, abandoned the fight. But Athens stood alone, and despite being outnumbered, despite facing the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, the Athenians fought on. And through their valor, their skill, their refusal to surrender, they won. They defeated the Atlantean invasion. They pushed the invaders back, liberating the lands they had conquered, saving the Mediterranean peoples from slavery. But then, as if the universe itself was delivering judgment on the Atlanteans for their hubris and aggression, catastrophe struck. In a single day and night of misfortune, earthquakes shook the earth and floods rose from the sea. The Athenian army, even in victory, was swallowed by the ground. And Atlantis, that mighty island nation, that paradise blessed by the gods, that empire which had seemed invincible, sank beneath the waves and disappeared forever into the depths of the ocean. According to Plato, this happened 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place the destruction of Atlantis at around 9,600 before the Common Era, near the end of the last ice age, in a period when human civilization as we understand it was just beginning to emerge from nomadic hunting and gathering into settled agricultural communities. And that, according to Plato, is why the sea beyond the Pillars of Heracles, what we call the Atlantic Ocean, is impassable in certain areas. The sunken island left vast shoals of mud just below the surface, making navigation impossible. This was Plato's explanation for why the Greeks knew so little about the Atlantic, why they hadn't explored it, why it remained mysterious and dangerous. This is the story. This is the legend exactly as Plato told it in Timaeus and Critias. A mighty island nation, blessed by divine heritage, rich beyond measure, powerful beyond compare, ultimately destroyed in a single catastrophic day because of its own corruption and hubris. A cautionary tale, a mystery, a paradise lost. And for more than 2,000 years, people have been trying to figure out what it means, whether any part of it is true, and if so, where Atlantis might have been. But before we dive into those questions, Before we explore the searches and theories and debates that have swirled around Atlantis for millennia, we need to understand the man who created this story. We need to understand Plato himself, his philosophy, his purposes, and why he might have invented a fictional civilization and presented it as historical fact. Who was Plato, and why did he write this? Plato was born around 428 before the Common Era into an aristocratic Athenian family. According to some later sources, his real name was Aristocles, though modern scholars debate this claim. He was called Plato, which may have referred to his broad shoulders or his broad forehead, Platos being the Greek word for broad, though this too comes from later biographical traditions. He was born during the height of Athens' power and prestige, but he grew up during the long, devastating Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, a conflict that would eventually result in Athens' effeat and temporary subjugation. As a young man, Plato fell under the influence of Socrates, that legendary gadfly philosopher who wandered the streets of Athens asking pointed questions and challenging people's assumptions about virtue, justice, knowledge, and the good life. Socrates never wrote anything down himself, but his method of inquiry, his relentless questioning, his dedication to pursuing truth wherever it led, profoundly shaped Plato's thinking. When Athens, in a moment of political fear and instability following its defeat in the war, put Socrates on trial for corrupting the youth and failing to honor the city's gods, and when Socrates was condemned to death and drank the poisonous hemlock rather than flee into exile, Plato was devastated. The experience marked him for life. It convinced him that democracy, at least as practiced in Athens, was flawed. It could not be trusted to make wise decisions. The many, swayed by emotion and rhetoric, had murdered the wisest and best man in the city. This conviction drove much of Plato's philosophical project. How should society be organized? Who should rule? How can we ensure that wisdom, rather than mere popular opinion, guides political decisions? These questions haunted him, and he spent his life trying to answer them through his philosophical writings and through the academy he founded, where he hoped to train a new generation of leaders who would combine wisdom with power. The Republic, Plato's most famous work, presents his answer. In that dialogue, Socrates describes an ideal city-state, organized according to strict principles of justice. Each person performs the role they're best suited for. The workers and artisans provide material necessities, the soldiers protect the city, and philosopher kings, people who have spent years studying philosophy and mathematics and truth, who understand the nature of the good itself, who love wisdom more than power. These philosopher kings rule, making decisions not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the entire city. It's a controversial vision, one that many readers throughout history have found either inspiring or disturbing. There's no democracy in Plato's ideal state. There's no privacy either, at least not for the ruling classes. There's censorship of poetry and music that might corrupt people's characters. The family is abolished for the guardian class, with children raised communally. Individual desires are subordinated to the good of the whole.
But the Republic is a thought experiment, a philosophical exploration of what justice means and how it might be realized in human society. It's not presented as a historical reality. It's an ideal, a standard against which we can measure actual societies and find them wanting. The Timaeus and Critias dialogues, where the Atlantis story appears, were meant to be something different. Plato wanted to show his ideal state not just as an abstract principle, but as something that had actually existed, that had actually worked, that had proven itself in the crucible of historical events. And more than that, he wanted to show what happens when initially good society becomes corrupted, when virtue gives way to vice, when moderation and wisdom are replaced by ambition and greed. Ancient Athens, in Plato's telling, represented his ideal state in action. It was organized according to principles of justice. Its citizens were virtuous. Its warriors were excellent.
And when tested against the greatest military power the world had ever seen, it triumphed, not through overwhelming force, but through courage, skill, and moral superiority. Atlantis, on the other hand, represented the corruption of an initially blessed society. The Atlanteans started out noble, wise, moderate, grateful for their divine heritage and abundant blessings. But over time, they became corrupted. They became greedy, ambitious, aggressive. They used their power not to maintain harmony, but to subjugate and conquer. And for this corruption, for this moral failure, they were destroyed, not by any human enemy, but by the gods themselves, by nature itself, by forces beyond their control. The story serves multiple purposes in Plato's philosophical project. It illustrates the difference between just and unjust societies. It shows the consequences of moral corruption. It demonstrates that virtue matters more than wealth or military power. It provides a historical example, or at least what appears to be a historical example, of principles Plato has spent his life exploring and defending. But here's where things get complicated. Plato was a philosophical writer, a creator of thought experiments and allegories. He was not a historian in the modern sense. He didn't cite sources or provide evidence in the way we'd expect from historical writing. His dialogues were literary and philosophical works, using historical settings and characters to explore timeless questions about how human beings should live. So, was Atlantis real? Did Plato believe it was real? Or was it, like so much else in his writing, a philosophical fiction, a useful story that illustrated important truths even if it never actually happened? This question has divided scholars for more than 2 millennia. In ancient times, some philosophers took Plato literally and believed that Atlantis had really existed. Others, equally learned and thoughtful, read the story as obvious allegory, a fictional creation designed to make philosophical points.
The strongest argument that Atlantis was Plato's invention is simply that nobody besides Plato ever mentions it. If there really had been an ancient Egyptian record of a vast island civilization destroyed thousands of years before, you'd expect other Greek writers who visited Egypt, other philosophers and historians who consulted Egyptian priests, to have encountered this story. But they didn't. Or if they did, they never wrote about it. The only source, the only ancient text that mentions Atlantis at all, is Plato's dialogues. Moreover, the details Plato provides are suspiciously neat, suspiciously convenient for his philosophical purposes. Ancient Athens just happens to be organized exactly like the ideal state Plato described in the Republic. Atlantis just happens to illustrate what happens when virtue is lost. The contrast between them just happens to prove the points Plato has been making throughout his philosophical career. And there are problems with Plato's geography. The Atlantic Ocean doesn't have massive mud shoals left by a sunken continent. Ocean floor mapping has revealed what's actually out there, and it's not what Plato described. The timeline also doesn't work. 9,000 years before Solon would place Atlantis' destruction at the end of the Ice Age, a time when human civilization was still in its infancy, nowhere near capable of the kind of sophisticated urban culture Plato describes. But Plato himself, through his characters, insists repeatedly that this story is true. Not a myth, not a fable, not an allegory, but actual history. Why would he do that if he was making it up? Why undermine his own credibility by presenting obvious fiction as fact? One answer is that Plato understood something about the power of stories. A philosophical argument might convince the intellect, but a vivid narrative, a dramatic story of mighty civilizations rising and falling, of catastrophes and heroism and divine judgment, that reaches something deeper. It engages the imagination. It moves the emotions. It sticks in memory in a way that abstract arguments don't. By presenting Atlantis as history, Plato gave it weight and authority. He made it feel real, made it matter in a way that an obvious allegory might not. And perhaps he understood that the truth of a story isn't always about whether the events literally happened. Perhaps he understood that some truths
particularly moral and philosophical truths, are better conveyed through narrative than through logical argument. Or perhaps, and this is a possibility we have to consider, Plato actually believed the story. Perhaps he heard it from a family member who heard it from their grandfather who claimed to have heard it from Solon, who claimed to have heard it in Egypt. Perhaps Plato, despite his philosophical sophistication, believed he was passing on genuine ancient history rather than creating a philosophical fiction. We'll never know for certain what Plato believed or intended.
The man himself is long dead, and the ancient world that might have preserved records of his sources or the original Egyptian texts has vanished. What we're left with is the story itself, a tale of a lost civilization that has captured human imagination for more than 2,000 years, inspiring countless searches, theories, dreams, and debates. And in the next part of our journey, we'll explore how the ancient world responded to Plato's story, how later philosophers and historians grappled with the question of Atlantis' reality, and how this ancient tale survived through the centuries to become one of the most enduring mysteries in human culture. But for now, rest for a moment. Let these images settle in your mind. In ancient Athens, organized according to principles of justice, a vast island empire in the Atlantic, blessed by the gods, rich beyond measure, ultimately destroyed by its own corruption. A philosopher in Athens, writing by lamplight, crafting a story that would echo through millennia. Now we need to travel forward through time, watching as this story rippled through the ancient world, seeing how different scholars, philosophers, and historians responded to this tale of a lost civilization. The fascinating thing about Atlantis is that from the very beginning, from the moment Plato's dialogues began circulating in the ancient world, people disagreed about what to make of it. Some believed it completely, others dismissed it as obvious fiction. And this division, this fundamental disagreement about whether Atlantis was real, has persisted for more than 2,000 years. Plato's own student Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers in human history and a towering intellect in his own right, apparently thought his teacher had invented Atlantis to serve his philosophical purposes. There's a fragment preserved from one of Aristotle's lost works where he discusses Atlantis and suggests that Plato was its sole creator. The implication is clear. Aristotle, who studied with Plato for 20 years at the Academy, who knew his teacher's methods and purposes intimately, believed Atlantis was a fictional device, a thought experiment crafted to illustrate philosophical principles. This is significant. If Plato's own brilliant student, who had access to Plato's thinking and methods in a way that later generations never could, concluded that Atlantis was invented, that carries considerable weight. Aristotle was not one to dismiss ideas lightly, but he also wasn't one to accept stories without evidence. His philosophy was grounded in observation, in studying the natural world, in collecting data. And apparently, he saw no evidence for Atlantis beyond Plato's dialogues. But not everyone in the ancient world shared Aristotle's skepticism. Some philosophers and historians took Plato at his word and believed that Atlantis had really existed. The reasons for this belief varied. Some were convinced by Plato's repeated insistence that the story was true. Others were intrigued by the details Plato provided, the names of kings and gods, the descriptions of geographical features, the seemingly specific details that seemed to be more than mere invention.
Others found the details so specific, so vivid, that they couldn't imagine it was entirely invented. Still others pointed to evidence they thought supported the story, geological formations or historical records that seemed to align with Plato's account. One of the most interesting ancient believers in Atlantis was Crantor, a philosopher who lived about a century after Plato. According to much later sources writing centuries after Crantor's time, he claimed to have seen Egyptian pillars that contained records of Atlantis, the very same records that the priests supposedly showed to Solon. Modern scholars are skeptical of this claim, given that it comes from sources writing long after Crantor lived. Whether Crantor actually saw such pillars, whether he made any such claim at all, or whether later writers attributed this to him, we can't know with certainty. But the story suggests that at least some ancient traditions held that Atlantis had a basis in Egyptian records, that it wasn't purely Plato's invention. The historian Proclus, writing in the 5th century of the Common Era, hundreds of years after Plato, also believed in Atlantis's historicity. He argued that it was entirely reasonable to think that such an island had existed and been destroyed. The world was vast, after all. Catastrophes did happen. Why should it be so hard to believe that a great island civilization had risen and fallen thousands of years in the past? Proclus pointed to what he considered geological evidence. The Atlantic Ocean, he noted, had changed over time. Islands had appeared and disappeared. Volcanic activity reshaped coastlines. If the Earth itself was subject to such dramatic transformations, why couldn't an entire island sink beneath the waves? What seemed impossible to some struck Proclus as entirely plausible given the dynamic nature of the planet. Other ancient writers approached Atlantis more cautiously. They didn't necessarily believe the entire story, but they thought it might contain elements of truth mixed with fiction. Perhaps there had been a great island in the Atlantic, though maybe not as large or as advanced as Plato described. Perhaps there had been catastrophic floods in the ancient past, though maybe not exactly 9,000 years before Solon. The story might be exaggerated, embellished, distorted by time and retelling, but that didn't mean there was no historical kernel at its core. This more nuanced view recognized something important about how stories work, especially stories passed down orally through multiple generations before being written down. Details change, numbers get inflated, events get dramatized, but sometimes buried within the embellishments, there's a real event, a genuine catastrophe or migration or cultural memory that sparked the tale. It's worth noting that the ancient world had plenty of experience with catastrophic events that reshaped geography. Volcanic eruptions destroyed cities. Earthquakes caused coastal lands to sink or rise.
Floods wiped out settlements. The Mediterranean world was, and still is, geologically active, subject to dramatic transformations. So the idea that an island could be destroyed by natural catastrophe didn't seem far-fetched to ancient people. They'd seen it happen on smaller scales. Why not on a grand scale as well? As the centuries passed and the classical world gave way to medieval Europe, interest in Atlantis waned somewhat. Medieval scholars had other concerns, other texts to study, other questions to pursue. Plato's dialogues were known, certainly, but they weren't at the center of intellectual life the way they'd been in ancient Athens or Alexandria. The story of Atlantis survived in libraries and monasteries, copied by scribes, passed down, but not actively debated or discussed the way it had been in antiquity. But Atlantis never entirely disappeared from human consciousness. The story was too powerful, too compelling. And when the Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical texts, when European scholars began recovering and translating ancient manuscripts, when the spirit of inquiry and exploration swept through the learned world, Atlantis emerged from the shadows once more. The age of exploration particularly revived interest in Atlantis. As European ships ventured across the Atlantic Ocean, as they discovered lands and peoples previously unknown to them, as the world suddenly became larger and stranger than medieval geography had imagined, people began wondering whether those newly discovered lands might be remnants of Atlantis, or whether the indigenous peoples of the Americas might be descendants of Atlantean survivors. Christopher Columbus, sailing west to reach Asia and instead encountering an entirely unexpected continent, contributed to this renewed speculation. If vast landmasses could exist in the Atlantic that ancient Europeans knew nothing about, couldn't Atlantis have existed too? The ocean was clearly far larger and more complex than the ancients had imagined. Who knew what else might be out there, or what might have been there in the past? But throughout all these centuries, from Plato's time through the ancient world, through the Middle Ages and Renaissance, one thing remained constant: the debate. Was Atlantis real or imaginary? Historical fact or philosophical fiction?
evidence of a lost civilization, or a morality tale about hubris and corruption? People continued to disagree, continued to debate, continued to search for answers. And that debate continues today, 24 centuries after Plato first told the story. The Minoan connection. Now we need to jump forward to the modern era and explore the most scientifically credible theory about what might have inspired Plato's Atlantis story. Because while most scholars today believe that Atlantis, as Plato described it, never existed, many think there might be a real historical event behind the legend.
And the most compelling candidate for that event is the catastrophic eruption of a volcano on an island called Thera, and the destruction of the advanced Bronze Age civilization known as the Minoans. Let's travel back in time again, not to Plato's Athens, but much further back, to the Aegean Sea around the year 1600 before the Common Era. This is the Bronze Age, a period when human civilization in the Mediterranean has advanced considerably from its Neolithic roots. People live in cities, engage in long-distance trade, work with metals, develop writing systems, create sophisticated art. And one of the most impressive civilizations of this era is centered on the island of Crete. The Minoans, as modern archaeologists call them, named after the legendary King Minos of later Greek mythology, were a maritime people, skilled sailors and traders who established a network of contacts throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Their palace complexes, particularly the famous palace at Knossos, were architectural marvels, multi-story buildings with sophisticated plumbing systems, beautiful frescoes covering the walls, storerooms filled with goods from across the known world. The Minoans had a writing system called Linear A, which unfortunately we still can't fully decipher, but which clearly served administrative and religious purposes. They produced exquisite pottery, delicate gold jewelry, elaborate ceremonial vessels. They built ships capable of crossing open water. They traded with Egypt, with the peoples of the Levantine coast, with the Greek mainland, with Cyprus, and beyond. This was a prosperous, sophisticated civilization, one that had reached a level of cultural and technological development that wouldn't be matched in the Aegean in centuries after its fall. And 70 miles north of Crete, there was an island called Thera, which we know today as Santorini. Thera was a volcanic island, home to a Minoan settlement called Akrotiri, and sometime around 1600 BCE, though the exact date remains debated among scholars, the volcano exploded in one of the most violent eruptions in human history. The explosion was so powerful that it registered as a 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a scale that goes from 0 to 8. To put that in perspective, Mount St. Helens in 1980 was a 5, Krakatoa in 1883 was a 6, Thera was a 7. The eruption blasted an estimated 28 to 41 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice into the atmosphere. The volcanic column rose 25 miles into the sky. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean, as far away as Egypt and Turkey. The sound of the explosion would have been audible hundreds of miles away, and most dramatically, the eruption emptied the magma chamber beneath the island so completely that much of Thera's central portion collapsed, creating the massive caldera, the sea-filled crater that exists today.
The settlement at Akrotiri was buried under meters of volcanic ash, entombed and preserved like Pompeii would be over 1,000 years later when Mount Vesuvius erupted. The Minoans on Thera had warning, though. Archaeological evidence shows that they had time to evacuate. There are no bodies at Akrotiri, no household valuables left behind, suggesting that people grabbed what they could and fled before the final catastrophic eruption. But while the people of Akrotiri may have escaped, the eruption had devastating effects throughout the region. The blast likely triggered a series of tsunamis that crashed into the northern coast of Crete. Archaeological evidence from Cretan coastal sites shows layers of chaos. Tsunami deposits mixing soil with pumice, destroyed buildings, evidence of sudden catastrophic flooding. The timing here is important. Archaeological dating places the eruption around 1600 BCE, and around the same time, perhaps immediately after, perhaps within a few decades, the Minoan civilization entered a period of dramatic decline. Palace complexes on Crete were damaged, some abandoned, others rebuilt but never regaining their former glory. The cultural vitality that had characterized the early Minoan period seemed to fade. Within a few generations, mainland Greeks, the Mycenaeans, had become the dominant power in the Aegean, while Minoan culture receded into memory. What caused this decline? That's been debated for decades. Some scholars argue that the Thera eruption was the primary cause, that the tsunamis, ashfall, and economic disruption directly led to Minoan collapse. Others point out that while the eruption certainly caused significant damage, it might not have been immediately fatal to Minoan civilization. There's evidence that some Minoan sites continued functioning for decades after the eruption. The decline might have been more gradual, the result of multiple factors, including natural disasters, economic problems, and invasions by mainland peoples. But regardless of the specific causal chains, it's clear that a catastrophic volcanic eruption destroyed an island, devastated a sophisticated maritime civilization, and left lasting impacts throughout the eastern Mediterranean. And this is where the connection to Atlantis becomes compelling. In the 1960s and 1970s, several scholars, most notably the seismologist Angelos Galanopoulos and the archaeologist James Mavor, proposed that Plato's Atlantis story was actually a distorted memory of the Thera eruption and Minoan civilization. The parallels were striking. A sophisticated island civilization, a catastrophic destruction involving volcanic activity and floods, a culture with advanced architecture and engineering, a maritime power that influenced peoples throughout its region.
The theory gained popular attention and remains today the most academically respectable explanation for Atlantis, though it's important to note that most archaeologists and historians still don't believe Plato was describing Thera and the Minoans, even in distorted form. But let's explore the parallels and see why this theory has persisted. First, there's the island setting itself. Atlantis was described as an island civilization. Thera was an island. Crete, the heart of Minoan power, is also an island. Both civilizations were maritime, dependent on ships and sea trade. Second, the sophisticated culture. Plato describes Atlantis as having advanced architecture, engineering, art, and urban planning. The Minoans certainly had all of these. The palace complexes, the plumbing systems, the beautiful frescoes, the evidence of organized administration, all of this demonstrates a high level of cultural development. Third, the catastrophic destruction. Atlantis sank beneath the waves in a day and night of earthquakes and floods. While Crete itself didn't sink, the eruption of Thera certainly involved earthquakes, and the resulting tsunamis would have seemed like the sea rising up to destroy coastal settlements. The suddenness and violence of the destruction match Plato's description. Fourth, the circular harbor. Plato describes Atlantis as having alternating rings of land and water, with canals connecting them. The caldera of Santorini today is roughly circular, with remnants of the island forming a broken ring around the central bay. Could Plato or his sources have been describing this distinctive geography? Fifth, the rich resources. Atlantis was blessed with abundant natural resources, including precious metals. The Aegean Bronze Age civilizations certainly had access to copper, tin, gold, and silver, all essential to their prosperity. And sixth, though this is more speculative, some scholars have suggested that Plato's mysterious metal orichalcum might have been inspired by volcanic glass or certain copper alloys that shone distinctively in sunlight, materials that would have been associated with the volcanic Aegean islands. The main problem with this theory, the reason most scholars remain skeptical, is the chronology. Plato explicitly dates the destruction of Atlantis to 9,000 years before Solon, which would be around 9600 BCE. The Thera eruption happened around 1600 BCE. That's an 8,000-year discrepancy. How could such a massive error occur? Proponents of the Minoan Atlantis theory, particularly Galanopoulos, propose that there was a mistake in transmission, that when the Egyptian priests told the story to Solon, or when Solon's descendants passed it down, someone multiplied the numbers by 10.
Instead of 9,000 years, it should have been 900 years, which would place the event right around the time of the Thera eruption. Similarly, Plato describes Atlantis as larger than Libya and Asia combined, which seems impossibly large. But if we divide by 10, we get an island about the size of Crete, which is actually quite close to accurate. The armies and navies Plato describes also seem inflated by about a factor of 10. So perhaps throughout the story, numbers got multiplied, either through misunderstanding of Egyptian numerical systems or through the natural exaggeration that occurs when stories are retold. It's an interesting suggestion, and it makes the theory more plausible, but it also requires assuming a systematic error throughout the account, which is a significant leap. Moreover, even if we correct the chronology, there are many specific details in Plato's account that simply don't match the Minoan world. The geography of Atlantis, located beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean, doesn't match Thera or Crete in the Aegean. The political organization Plato describes, with 10 kings ruling different portions of the island in a confederacy, doesn't match what we know of Minoan political structure. And perhaps most importantly, Plato's description of Athens in the story, organized exactly like his ideal republic, clearly isn't historical. Athens in 1600 BCE was nowhere near as developed as Plato describes. If Plato invented that part of the story, why should we believe the Atlantis portion is based on real events? Nevertheless, the Minoan theory remains compelling because it identifies a real catastrophic event that resembles key elements of the Atlantis story. A volcanic eruption did destroy an island. Tsunamis did devastate a maritime civilization. A sophisticated Bronze Age culture did collapse. Even if Plato wasn't directly describing these events, even if the connection is coincidental or based on general cultural memories rather than specific historical knowledge, the parallels are striking. And excavations at Akrotiri have revealed a Bronze Age city that truly does feel like a window into a lost world. The buildings, preserved under volcanic ash, still have their frescoes intact. The paintings show elegant ships sailing between islands, women in elaborate dress, dolphins leaping through blue waters, lilies blooming, scenes of prosperity and beauty from a civilization that vanished catastrophically. Walking through the ruins today, seeing these images from over 3,500 years ago, it's easy to feel you're glimpsing something extraordinary. A civilization that achieved remarkable things and then was suddenly destroyed. Whether the civilization inspired Plato's Atlantis remains debatable. Most scholars say no, that Atlantis was Plato's philosophical invention, and any resemblance to real historical events is either coincidental or based on such general patterns, islands being destroyed by natural catastrophes, that the connection is too vague to be meaningful. But a minority of scholars, and many popular writers, continue to find the parallels too strong to ignore.
And regardless of whether the Minoan theory is correct, the eruption of Thera and the fate of the Minoans represent one of the most dramatic stories in Bronze Age history, a real catastrophe that reshaped the ancient Mediterranean world and left a cultural memory that echoed through later Greek civilization. Other proposed locations through history. The Minoan theory is far from the only attempt to locate Atlantis. In fact, over the past few centuries, people have proposed hundreds of different locations, ranging from the scientifically plausible to the wildly speculative. Atlantis has been placed in virtually every ocean, on every continent, even in outer space in the more imaginative theories. Let's explore some of the major proposed locations and understand why each has been suggested. First, let's consider theories that place Atlantis in the Mediterranean, beyond Thera and Crete. Cyprus has been proposed, particularly its southern coast, where underwater formations have been interpreted by some as possible ruins. The geological setting is interesting. Cyprus sits along a tectonically active zone, where the African and Eurasian plates converge. Earthquakes are common, and coastal subsidence has occurred. Some proponents point to ancient harbor works now underwater as evidence of catastrophic sea level changes. But the problems are significant.
Cyprus has been continuously inhabited since prehistoric times, and we have extensive archaeological knowledge of the island's history. There's no evidence of a lost civilization matching Plato's description, no sudden catastrophic destruction, no cultural memory among the island's inhabitants of anything resembling Atlantis. Sardinia is another Mediterranean candidate. The Italian archaeologist Luigi Usai has extensively argued for this location, pointing to the island's unique Bronze Age stone structures called nuraghi, megalithic towers that dot the landscape. Sardinia certainly had an advanced Bronze Age culture, and some of these structures in the southern part of the island show evidence of destruction by flooding. The Sardinia theory gained some attention when researchers noted that some nuraghi below certain elevations appear to have been abandoned after catastrophic events, possibly related to tsunamis or floods. The island's location in the western Mediterranean, its size, its Bronze Age sophistication, all make it an interesting candidate. But again, the archaeology doesn't support a sudden, catastrophic destruction matching Plato's account, and the chronology doesn't work. The nuraghi civilization flourished much later than Plato's supposed date for Atlantis. Moving west, we find theories placing Atlantis near the Strait of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Heracles that Plato mentions. The Donana National Park in southern Spain has been proposed as a location, with researchers pointing to circular formations visible in satellite imagery that they interpret as remnants of Atlantis's distinctive ring-shaped harbor. The geological setting is certainly dramatic. The strait has been subject to significant changes over time. During ice ages, when sea levels were lower, more land was exposed. Coastal areas have been flooded as seas rose. The region experiences earthquakes and has active geology, and there's historical evidence of sophisticated settlements in southern Spain during the Bronze Age, including the mysterious Tartessian culture that flourished in the first millennium BCE. But extensive archaeological work in the region has found no evidence of a catastrophically destroyed civilization matching Plato's description. The circular formations visible in satellite imagery can be explained by natural geological processes or later historical settlements. And while Tartessos was certainly an interesting culture, it existed thousands of years later than Plato's supposed date for Atlantis and wasn't destroyed in a single catastrophic event. Now, let's venture into the Atlantic Ocean itself, the location that most people instinctively associate with Atlantis, given its name. The Azores, a group of volcanic islands roughly 1,000 miles west of Portugal, have long been proposed as either remnants of Atlantis or colonies of the Atlantean Empire. The argument points to their volcanic nature, their location in the Atlantic, and underwater geological features that some interpret as possible evidence of larger land masses that have since subsided. The problem is geology. The Azores are volcanic islands formed by the Mid-Atlantic Ridge where the Eurasian and North American tectonic plates are spreading apart. They've never been part of a larger continent. The geological record is clear on this. These islands formed through volcanic activity over millions of years. They've grown and changed, but they were never part of an Atlantis-sized landmass that sank. More dramatic Atlantic theories place Atlantis in Antarctica, pointing to underwater formations near the Bahamas, particularly the famous Bimini Road, a formation of rectangular stones on the ocean floor that some believe is a remnant of an ancient harbor or roadway. When this formation was discovered in 1968, it created considerable excitement among Atlantis enthusiasts. But geological surveys have conclusively shown that the Bimini Road is a natural formation, created by the fracturing and erosion of beach rock, a type of sedimentary rock that forms in coastal areas and can create linear patterns. It's an interesting geological feature, but it's not evidence of a lost civilization. And while the Caribbean certainly has a rich archaeological record with many ancient cultures, none of them match Plato's description of Atlantis. Perhaps the most extreme Atlantic theory places Atlantis in Antarctica.
This idea was popularized by Charles Hapgood and later by Graham Hancock, who argued that Antarctica was ice-free in the relatively recent past and might have been home to an advanced civilization before some catastrophic shift moved it to its current polar position, covering it with ice. The theory relies on the concept of crustal displacement. The idea that Earth's outer crust can shift rapidly over the mantle, moving continents to different latitudes. This would explain how Antarctica could have had a temperate climate in the past and been habitable. Proponents point to old maps, particularly the Piri-Reis map from 1513, which they claim shows Antarctica's coastline before it was covered by ice. But geology again provides the answer. The theory of crustal displacement is not supported by modern geophysics. We understand plate tectonics now. Continents move slowly over millions of years, not rapidly in catastrophic shifts. Antarctica has been in its current position for many millions of years and has been glaciated for at least 34 million years. The ice cores from Antarctica provide a continuous climate record going back hundreds of thousands of years, confirming that it's been ice-covered throughout the time period relevant to human civilization. As for the Piri-Reis map, careful analysis shows that it doesn't actually depict Antarctica. What some researchers interpreted as Antarctic coastline is actually a continuation of the South American coast, drawn based on incomplete information and artistic interpretation, common in maps of that era. Other theories have placed Atlantis in the North Sea, arguing that it was actually Doggerland, the now submerged landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe before being flooded as sea levels rose after the last ice age. Doggerland was certainly real, and it certainly was inhabited. Archaeological evidence shows that Mesolithic people lived on this land, but it was flooded gradually over thousands of years as glaciers melted, not in a single catastrophic event. And the people living there were nomadic hunter-gatherers, not the sophisticated urban civilization Plato describes. Ireland has been proposed, particularly in theory suggesting that Plato's Pillars of Heracles didn't refer to the Strait of Gibraltar, but to some other location, perhaps marking the entrance to the Irish Sea. Underwater formations off Ireland's coast have been interpreted as possible ruins. But again, Ireland's archaeological record is well documented, and while it certainly has a rich prehistoric heritage, including impressive megalithic monuments, there's no evidence of a catastrophically destroyed civilization matching Atlantis. Even inland locations have been proposed. Bolivia, particularly the area around Lake Titicaca, has its proponents who point to the ancient ruins of Tiwanaku and argue that this high-altitude location matches some of Plato's descriptions better than island locations.
The mathematics of Plato's measurements, they argue, work better when applied to this Bolivian site than to proposed Atlantic islands. It's an interesting argument, but it requires essentially reinterpreting everything Plato said about Atlantis' location. We have to ignore his explicit statement that it was beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic Ocean. We have to ignore the maritime nature of the civilization. We have to transform an island into a highland lake basin. At a certain point, we're no longer looking for Atlantis as Plato described it, but creating a new story based on loosely similar details. This pattern repeats across virtually all proposed Atlantis locations. Proponents find some features that match elements of Plato's description, whether it's circular formations, volcanic activity, evidence of ancient civilization, or catastrophic destruction. They emphasize these similarities while downplaying or explaining away the many details that don't match. They're forced to reinterpret Plato's explicit geographical statements, adjust his chronology, or argue that parts of his account were corrupted in transmission. The fundamental problem is that Plato's description is simultaneously too specific and too vague. It's specific enough that no real location matches all the details, but vague enough that many locations can be made to fit if we select certain elements and ignore others. It's like looking at clouds and seeing familiar shapes. With enough imagination and selective attention, you can find what you're looking for almost anywhere. And that's before we even get into the truly fringe theories that place Atlantis in outer space, or make it a colony of extraterrestrials, or connected to every ancient mystery from the pyramids of Egypt to the stone heads of Easter Island. These theories have left the realm of archaeology and history entirely, venturing into pure speculation untethered from evidence. What all these proposed locations reveal is less about Atlantis itself, and more about the human need to solve mysteries, to find lost paradises, to believe that ancient peoples possessed knowledge or capabilities we've forgotten. Atlantis has become a kind of mirror where each searcher sees their own preoccupations reflected back. Those concerned with catastrophism see evidence of sudden destruction. Those interested in ancient technology see sophisticated engineering. Those drawn to mysticism see spiritual wisdom. But if we step back and look at the evidence objectively, if we set aside our wishes and hopes and just examine what we actually know, the conclusion becomes clear. There is no archaeological, geological, or historical evidence for Atlantis as Plato described it. Not in the Atlantic, not in the Mediterranean, not anywhere. Every proposed location requires substantially reinterpreting or ignoring major elements of Plato's account. Every location has been thoroughly investigated by archaeologists and found wanting.
The most likely explanation remains the simplest one. Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical fiction, a story designed to illustrate his ideas about justice, virtue, political organization, and the consequences of moral corruption. Like many philosophers before and after him, he used narrative to convey truths that pure logical argument might not reach as effectively. But saying Atlantis wasn't real doesn't diminish the story's power or importance. In many ways, it makes it more interesting. Because what we're left with isn't a historical mystery to be solved, but something richer and more complex. A story that tells us about human nature, about the rise and fall of civilizations, about hubris and divine judgment, about the fragility of even the mightiest empires. And that story, whether anchored in historical fact or not, has spoken to people across cultures and centuries, inspiring exploration, imagination, and endless fascination. We need to travel now to a very different time and place. From ancient Athens and Bronze Age islands, we're jumping to the United States of America in the late 19th century, to a moment when Atlantis was about to be transformed from an obscure ancient philosophical tale into a cultural phenomenon that would captivate the modern world. The year is 1882. America is emerging from the turmoil of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The Industrial Revolution is reshaping the landscape, bringing railroads, factories, and cities where farms and wilderness had been. The economy is unstable, swinging between boom and bust. Political corruption is rampant. The gap between rich and poor is widening. It's a time of dramatic change and considerable anxiety, when many Americans feel that the nation has lost its way, that the agrarian paradise of the founding has been replaced by something harder, crueler, more mercenary. In this setting, we meet Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, a man whose life embodies many of the contradictions and disappointed hopes of his era. Donnelly was born in 1831 in Philadelphia to Irish Catholic immigrant parents. His father, a physician, died when Ignatius was young, leaving the family in difficult circumstances. But young Ignatius was brilliant, ambitious, driven. He excelled in school, particularly in literature and rhetoric. He became a lawyer, entered politics, and moved to the Minnesota Territory in 1857, with dreams of building a utopian community on the frontier. Those dreams didn't work out the way he hoped. The utopian colony failed. His land development schemes collapsed. But Donnelly proved remarkably resilient. He turned to politics with renewed energy, serving in Congress as a Republican during and after the Civil War, then becoming a leading voice in the populist movement, championing farmers and workers against what he saw as the corrupt power of bankers and industrialists. By the 1880s, Donnelly was in his 50s. His political career had stalled, and he was looking for new outlets for his restless energy and wide-ranging intellect. He'd always been interested in history, archaeology, and ancient civilizations. He'd read extensively about Native American cultures, Egyptian monuments, and the prehistoric past. And he'd encountered Plato's dialogues about Atlantis, that strange story of a lost island civilization
that no other ancient source mentioned. Most scholars at the time dismissed Atlantis as obvious fiction, but Donnelly, with his populist instincts and his tendency toward grand dramatic theories, saw something else. He saw a mystery that could be solved, a truth that establishment scholars had overlooked or deliberately suppressed. And more than that, he saw a story that could explain patterns he'd noticed in his wide reading about ancient cultures around the world. Why did civilizations in Egypt and Mesopotamia, in India and China, in Mexico and Peru, all develop similar technologies and similar cultural practices at roughly the same time? Why did they all build pyramids, develop writing, work with bronze and gold, create sophisticated astronomical observations? The conventional answer was independent invention, different peoples solving similar problems in similar ways. But Donnelly found this unsatisfying. It seemed more plausible to him that these civilizations must have had a common source, a mother civilization that had taught them, a place from which knowledge and technology had spread. And what better candidate for that mother civilization than Atlantis? Located in the Atlantic Ocean, it would have been perfectly positioned to influence both the Old World and the New World. Its destruction would explain why direct evidence of this connection had been lost. Its advanced technology would explain how it could have seeded multiple civilizations. Everything fit together beautifully. In 1882, Donnelly published his masterwork, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In this book, which he'd written with remarkable speed and enthusiasm, he laid out his grand theory. Atlantis, he argued, had really existed, exactly as Plato described it. It had been the first true civilization, where humanity first rose from barbarism to culture. From Atlantis, colonists and refugees had spread across the world, bringing knowledge to primitive peoples, teaching them agriculture, architecture, metalworking, and writing. Donnelly marshaled an impressive array of evidence for his theory. He pointed to flood myths found in cultures around the world, from the biblical deluge to Mesopotamian flood stories to Native American legends. All of these, he argued, were cultural memories of the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis. He compared similarities in architecture between Egypt and Central America, suggesting both inherited pyramid building from Atlantis.
He analyzed linguistic similarities between Old and New World languages, arguing they derived from a common Atlantean tongue. He discussed the legend of the Garden of Eden, identifying it with Atlantis. He interpreted Greek mythology as distorted memories of Atlantean kings and queens. He examined the distribution of cultivated plants and domesticated animals, arguing that their spread could be explained by Atlantean colonization. He looked at ancient calendars, religious symbols, artistic motifs, finding connections and patterns everywhere he looked. The book was densely packed with information, moving rapidly from topic to topic, comparing civilizations, citing ancient texts, making bold claims. Donnelly wrote with passion and conviction. He genuinely believed he'd solved one of history's greatest mysteries, and he wasn't shy about the significance of his discovery. In his view, recognizing Atlantis as real would revolutionize our understanding of human history. It would prove that civilization was far older than previously thought. It would demonstrate that ancient peoples were far more advanced than scholars believed. It would vindicate Plato and expose the arrogance of modern academics who dismissed the ancient sources. The book was a sensation. It sold well immediately and continued selling for decades. Harper Brothers, his publisher, issued 7 printings in the first year alone. Newspapers reviewed it extensively, often favorably. Even William Gladstone, the British Prime Minister and a classical scholar himself, wrote Donnelly an enthusiastic letter praising the work. The book was translated into multiple languages. It sparked fierce debates in popular magazines and scientific journals. Why was Atlantis, the antediluvian world, so successful? Partly because Donnelly was a skilled writer who made his case compellingly. Partly because the late 19th century was a period of intense interest in archaeology and ancient civilizations, with exciting discoveries being made regularly in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Central America. Partly because the book offered a grand romantic vision of the past that appealed to people's imaginations. But also, I think, because the book spoke to deeper anxieties and longings of Donnelly's era. At a time when rapid industrialization was destroying traditional ways of life, when immigrants were transforming American society, when old certainties seemed to be crumbling, the idea of Atlantis offered a vision of a lost golden age, a time when civilization was unified, harmonious, blessed with wisdom and power. It was a paradise before the fall, a perfection that had been lost, but might somehow be recovered, or at least remembered. Donnelly's Atlantis wasn't just a historical place. It was a symbol, a myth in the deepest sense. It represented everything modern civilization had lost: unity, wisdom, harmony with nature, connection to the divine. And even though modern scholars rejected Donnelly's arguments, even though his evidence was selective and his logic often flawed, the emotional and imaginative appeal of his vision proved enormously powerful. The influence of Donnelly's book on subsequent Atlantis speculation cannot be overstated. Almost every modern conception of Atlantis derives from his work. The idea that Atlantis was the source of all civilization, that its refugees seeded cultures around the world, that its technology was advanced beyond anything in the ancient world, that its destruction was remembered in flood myths everywhere, all of these concepts come from Donnelly. Before his book, Atlantis was a relatively obscure ancient tale known mainly to classical scholars and philosophy students. After his book, Atlantis became a cultural icon, a household name, a mystery that captured the popular imagination. Adventurers began mounting expeditions to search for Atlantis. Other writers built on Donnelly's ideas, adding their own speculations and theories. Atlantis entered literature, art, and eventually film and television. But it's important to understand that Donnelly's approach represented a fundamental break from scholarly methodology. He wasn't following evidence to conclusions, he was starting with a conclusion, that Atlantis was real, and then searching for evidence that supported it while ignoring or explaining away contradictory evidence. He was practicing what we'd now call pseudo-archaeology or pseudo-history, creating narratives that sound plausible to non-experts, but that don't hold up under serious scrutiny. Professional archaeologists and historians at the time largely rejected Donnelly's work. They pointed out his selective use of evidence, his misunderstanding of archaeological chronology, his tendency to see connections where none existed. They noted that the similarities he found between different cultures were often superficial and could be explained by universal human tendencies rather than direct cultural transmission. They emphasized that genuine archaeological evidence didn't support his theories. But these scholarly critiques had limited impact on popular belief. Donnelly's book was too appealing, too imaginative, too well written to be dismissed just because experts disagreed with it. And this established a pattern that continues to this day, a split between scholarly consensus, which holds that Atlantis was fictional, and popular belief, which often assumes Atlantis was real and that scholars are either ignorant or deliberately hiding the truth. Donnelly followed Atlantis, the antediluvian world, with another catastrophist book, Ragnarok, The Age of Fire and Gravel, published in 1883. In this work, he argued that the Earth had been struck by a comet in prehistoric times, causing massive destruction and depositing the gravel layers found over much of the planet's surface. Again, professional geologists rejected his arguments, pointing out that the features he attributed to a comet impact were actually the result of glaciation during ice ages. But again, his vivid writing and dramatic narrative found an audience. Later, Donnelly would write books arguing that Francis Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays, using elaborate cryptographic methods to find hidden messages in the texts. This work was even more roundly rejected by scholars, but still found believers among those inclined to think that official history was wrong and that the truth lay hidden in plain sight for those clever enough to decode it. What Donnelly represents, beyond his specific theories about Atlantis or comets or Shakespeare, is a particular style of thinking about the past, one that values intuition over evidence, narrative over rigor, dramatic revelation over careful analysis. It's a style that has always existed, but Donnelly was perhaps its most influential 19th century practitioner, and his legacy continues to shape popular understanding of ancient history. After Donnelly, a succession of writers built on his work, adding new layers to the Atlantis myth. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, incorporated Atlantis into her spiritual system, claiming it had been home to a race of spiritually advanced beings. Edgar Cayce, the famous American psychic, made hundreds of predictions about Atlantis during his trance readings, describing it in elaborate detail and prophesying that remnants would rise from the sea near Bimini in the 1960s. Rudolf Steiner and other mystics wove Atlantis into their cosmological visions. In the 20th century, Atlantis became a staple of science fiction and fantasy literature. From Jules Verne to H.P. Lovecraft to countless pulp magazine stories, writers used Atlantis as a setting for adventures, as a source of ancient technology, as a warning about hubris and environmental catastrophe. Comic books featured Atlantis regularly. Films brought it to the screen. Television series explored it. Video games sent players to discover its secrets. And with each retelling, each new interpretation, Atlantis moved further from Plato's original philosophical tale and closer to becoming a modern myth, a story that reflected contemporary concerns rather than ancient Greek philosophy. In environmentalist versions, Atlantis was destroyed by its own technological arrogance, a cautionary tale about nuclear war or climate change. In New Age versions, Atlantis was a spiritual paradise whose wisdom could heal our fragmented modern world. In adventure stories, Atlantis was a source of powerful artifacts and dangerous secrets. The problem with this proliferation of Atlantis stories is that it makes serious discussion of the historical questions almost impossible. When someone mentions Atlantis, are they talking about Plato's philosophical allegory, Donnelly's lost mother civilization, Cayce's psychic visions, a Disney animated film?
The variations are so numerous and often contradictory that the concept has become almost meaningless, a blank slate onto which any idea can be projected. And yet Donnelly's influence persists. In 2015, an author named Graham Hancock published a book called Magicians of the Gods, which essentially updates Donnelly's thesis for the 21st century, arguing that an advanced civilization existed during the last ice age and was destroyed by catastrophic events, with survivors spreading to various parts of the world and founding the ancient civilizations we know. Hancock's books have been bestsellers. His Netflix series has been watched by millions, despite archaeologists pointing out the same problems with his evidence and arguments that they identified with Donnelly over a century ago. The persistence of these theories, despite consistent scholarly rejection, tells us something important about human psychology and the appeal of mystery. There's something deeply attractive about the idea of lost knowledge, advanced ancient civilizations, secrets that orthodox scholars refuse to acknowledge. It makes the past more exciting, more mysterious. It suggests that there's more to discover, that conventional wisdom might be wrong, and it allows readers to feel like they're part of an enlightened minority who see truths that others miss. But this appeal comes at a cost. It directs attention and energy away from genuine archaeological discoveries, which are often more fascinating than any fiction, but require patience and careful study to appreciate. It creates distrust of expert knowledge and scientific methodology. It sometimes carries unfortunate ideological baggage, as when claims about advanced ancient civilizations are used to suggest that modern indigenous peoples couldn't have built their own monuments and must have inherited them from some vanished superior race.
The true story of Atlantis, the story of how Plato's philosophical allegory became a modern obsession, is in many ways more interesting than any theory about its supposed location or reality. It's a story about how narratives work, about the power of myth, about the human need for mystery and meaning, about the tension between scholarly expertise and popular belief. Understanding this story, understanding how we got from Plato's dialogues to the vast proliferation of Atlantis theories that exist today, is essential for thinking clearly about what Atlantis actually was and what it means. The archaeological evidence, what we actually know. Now we need to talk about evidence, not the selective, interpreted, speculative evidence that fills books arguing for Atlantis's reality, but actual, verifiable, scientific evidence. What does archaeology, geology, oceanography, and historical research actually tell us about whether Atlantis existed? Let's start with the most basic question. Is there any archaeological evidence for a major civilization in the Atlantic Ocean during the time frame Plato suggests?
The answer is simply no. Not a trace, not a single artifact, not a single structure, not a single piece of evidence that any advanced urban civilization existed on a large Atlantic island that subsequently sank. How can we be so certain? Because we've looked extensively. The Atlantic Ocean floor has been mapped in detail using sonar and other technologies. We know what's down there. And what's down there is exactly what geological theory predicts, an ocean floor that has been underwater for many millions of years, with no evidence of recent land surfaces, no sunken cities, no traces of human habitation. The mid-Atlantic ridge, that underwater mountain range where the American and Eurasian African tectonic plates are spreading apart, has been thoroughly studied. Islands along the ridge, like the Azores, Iceland, and others, are volcanic in origin, formed by mantle plumes pushing up through the diverging plates. They've never been part of a larger landmass. The geological record is clear and consistent on this point. Could Atlantis have been located somewhere else in the Atlantic, away from the mid-Atlantic ridge? Again, ocean floor mapping provides the answer. The deep Atlantic basins have been underwater for tens of millions of years. The continental shelves around the Atlantic, the shallow areas near the continents, have been extensively studied. Some areas were exposed during ice ages when sea level was lower, but these were coastal plains, not large islands, and they were inhabited by Stone Age hunter-gatherers, not cities, not advanced engineering, not the kind of civilization Plato describes. The human cultures that existed during the time frames relevant to Atlantis theories were technologically sophisticated in their own ways, but they weren't building urban centers with harbors and temples and the complex political organizations Plato describes. But what about Plato's date of 9600 BCE? This places Atlantis near the end of the Ice Age. Could an advanced civilization have existed then? Here, archaeology is absolutely clear. No. In 9600 BCE, human beings around the world were hunter-gatherers.
The agricultural revolution, the shift to farming that enabled settled communities and eventually cities, hadn't begun yet. The earliest evidence for agriculture comes from the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East around 10,000 BCE. And even then, it took thousands of years for farming to develop into the kind of surplus-producing agriculture that could support cities. The first true cities, places like Jericho and Çatalhöyük, emerged around 9,000 to 7,000 BCE. And even these were modest settlements by later standards, nothing like the elaborate urban complexes Plato describes. The development of civilization was gradual. Agriculture, then settled villages, then towns, then cities, then complex political organizations, then writing and monumental architecture. This process took thousands of years and is well documented archaeologically. For Atlantis to have existed as Plato describes it in 9600 BCE, it would have had to have been thousands of years ahead of every other human culture on Earth. And then all trace of it would have to have disappeared completely, leaving no artifacts, no genetic legacy, no cultural influences on other peoples, nothing. This is not impossible in an absolute sense, but it strains credibility to the breaking point. What about later dates? If we adjust Plato's chronology, either through the divide by 10 correction that Minoan theory proponents suggest, or by assuming the date is simply wrong, could Atlantis have existed at some other time? This brings us back to the Minoan hypothesis, which we've already discussed, and to other Bronze Age civilizations in the Mediterranean. The advantage of these theories is that they're dealing with time periods where we know advanced civilizations did exist. The Minoans on Crete, the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, the Egyptians, the Hittites, various Levantine cultures. All of these were sophisticated societies with cities, writing, complex political organizations, international trade networks, impressive architecture and engineering. An island civilization like Plato describes certainly could have existed in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, but here's the problem. We know what existed in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. We've excavated hundreds of sites. We've deciphered ancient texts. We've traced trade networks. We've mapped the distribution of pottery styles and architectural forms. The Bronze Age Mediterranean is not a mystery. It's one of the best understood ancient periods and regions in all of archaeology. And nowhere in this well-documented world is there any trace of Atlantis. The island civilizations that did exist, like Crete, don't match Plato's descriptions in crucial ways. The political organizations don't fit, the geographic details don't align. The catastrophic destructions that occurred, like the Thera eruption, affected civilizations we know about, like the Minoans, but didn't involve vast islands sinking beneath the waves.
More fundamentally, if Atlantis had existed as a major power in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, it would have left traces in the historical and archaeological record. The Egyptians kept extensive records and wrote about their neighbors and trading partners. The Hittites did the same. Various Levantine peoples documented their interactions with other cultures, and nowhere in any of these records is there any mention of Atlantis. The argument that Atlantis might have been known by a different name doesn't help much, because we can account for the major powers of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. We know who was who, where they were located, what they were doing. There's no unaccounted for major island civilization that could be Atlantis under another name. What about the idea that establishment archaeologists are suppressing evidence for Atlantis, either because they're hidebound and resistant to new ideas, or because of some more sinister agenda? This argument appears frequently in pro-Atlantis literature and deserves to be addressed directly. The reality of academic archaeology is far less dramatic. Archaeologists are in the business of discovering new things. A genuine discovery of a previously unknown major ancient civilization would be career-making. It would bring fame, funding, job security, everything an academic could want. There's no incentive to suppress such evidence, and every incentive to pursue it. Moreover, archaeology is an international field with thousands of practitioners. A conspiracy to suppress Atlantis evidence would require coordinating across multiple countries, languages, institutions, and theoretical frameworks. It would require persuading archaeologists from different cultural backgrounds, different political systems, different religious traditions, all to cooperate in hiding the truth. This is logistically implausible and contradicted by the reality of how contentious and competitive academic fields actually are. What archaeologists do reject is poor evidence, circular reasoning, and pseudoscientific methodology. When someone claims that a natural rock formation is a sunken city without providing proper documentation and analysis, when someone makes grandiose claims based on selective reading of ancient texts while ignoring contradictory evidence, when someone proposes theories that contradict well-established geological or archaeological facts without adequate explanation, archaeologists push back not because they're suppressing truth, but because they're maintaining professional standards.
The scientific method requires that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Claiming that a major civilization existed in a specific place and time requires evidence of that civilization. Artifacts, structures, human remains, modification of the landscape, changes in local ecology, something. Speculation, interpretation of ambiguous features, and arguments from silence are not sufficient. So, where does this leave us?
If we're honest about the evidence, if we set aside wishful thinking and demand the same standards of proof that we'd apply to any other historical claim, the conclusion is clear. There is no archaeological or geological evidence for Atlantis as Plato described it, no sunken continent in the Atlantic, no advanced civilization in 9600 BCE, no major Bronze Age power that archaeology has somehow overlooked. This doesn't mean Plato was lying or that everyone who's been interested in Atlantis was foolish. It means that Plato was probably telling a philosophical story, using the literary device of presenting fiction as history to make his narrative more compelling. And it means that people who've been captivated by this story over the millennia were responding to real human needs for mystery, meaning, and connection to the past, even if the specific object of their fascination was fictional. The real archaeological record of the ancient Mediterranean is actually more fascinating than any Atlantis theory. The true story of how human civilization developed, how societies rose and fell, how cultures interacted and influenced each other, how people adapted to environmental changes and catastrophes, all of this is documented in the archaeological record and is rich with drama, complexity, and significance. The Minoans really did build sophisticated palace complexes on Crete. Their frescoes really do depict a culture of remarkable artistry and vitality. That their eruption really did create tsunamis and bury settlements. Bronze Age peoples really did engage in long-distance trade, exchanging goods and ideas across vast distances. Ancient engineers really did accomplish remarkable feats with the technology available to them. These real accomplishments don't need to be enhanced with fictional elements to be impressive. They don't need to be connected to mythical lost civilizations to be meaningful. The genuine past, recovered through careful archaeological work, is extraordinary enough on its own. And that's an important lesson from the Atlantis story. Sometimes the truth is less dramatic than the myth, but more substantial. Sometimes what actually happened is more significant than what we imagine might have happened. Sometimes evidence matters more than speculation. But acknowledging that Atlantis wasn't real doesn't mean we have to abandon the story entirely. It just means we need to understand it differently, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a story to be interpreted, not as history, but as myth, not as something lost in the past, but as something that continues to speak to us in the present about timeless human concerns. We've journeyed through 24 centuries of Atlantis fascination, from Plato's original philosophical dialogue through ancient debates, medieval preservation, Renaissance rediscovery, 19th century pseudoscience, and modern media interpretations. We've examined proposed locations from Antarctica to the Azores, from Santorini to Sardinia. We've looked at what archaeology and geology actually tell us, and we've come to a conclusion that many find disappointing. Atlantis, as Plato described it, almost certainly never existed. But that conclusion raises a more interesting question than whether Atlantis was real. The question is, why has this story endured? Why, after more than 2,000 years, despite the lack of evidence, despite scholarly consensus that it's fictional, does Atlantis continue to captivate human imagination? What need does this story fulfill? What does our persistent fascination with Atlantis tell us about ourselves? Let's start with the psychological appeal of lost civilizations in general. There's something deeply compelling about the idea that previous peoples achieved great things that have since been forgotten. It suggests that the past was not simply a progression from primitive to advanced, from ignorant to enlightened, but something more complex. It implies that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that civilizations can fall as well as rise, that we might not be the pinnacle of human achievement we imagine ourselves to be. This is simultaneously humbling and exciting. Humbling because it suggests our own civilization might be fragile, might be subject to the same catastrophes and declines that affected our predecessors. Exciting because it suggests there might be wisdom and knowledge from the past that we could recover, secrets waiting to be rediscovered, lost technologies that could be found. The appeal intensifies when we're talking specifically about an advanced ancient civilization, one that supposedly possessed knowledge or capabilities beyond what we think ancient peoples should have had. This touches on deep questions about human potential and historical progress. If ancient peoples could achieve remarkable things, what does that say about the human capacity for innovation? If they lost that knowledge, how did that happen? And could it happen to us? There's also the appeal of mystery itself. Human beings seem to be wired to find pleasure in solving puzzles, in seeking hidden knowledge, and in believing that beneath the surface of ordinary reality lie deeper truths waiting to be discovered. Mystery engages our curiosity, keeps our minds active, makes the world feel larger and more interesting than it might otherwise appear. Atlantis offers a perfect mystery. It's specific enough to seem potentially real. Plato provides detailed descriptions, names, measurements, political structures, but it's vague enough to be unfalsifiable. The specific location can be debated, the timeline can be adjusted, the details can be interpreted in multiple ways, and the supposed destruction means that absence of evidence can be explained away. Of course we haven't found it. It sank beneath the ocean. Of course there are no artifacts. They were destroyed in the catastrophe. This makes Atlantis an ideal canvas for projection.
Unlike historical civilizations where we have extensive evidence that constrains interpretation, Atlantis can be whatever we want it to be. We can project our own values, our own hopes and fears onto this blank slate. And different eras, different cultures, different individuals have done exactly that. For Plato, Atlantis represented a warning about corruption and hubris. For Renaissance scholars, it became evidence that the ancients had known more than medieval wisdom supposed. For 19th century romantics, it was a lost paradise, a golden age before the corruptions of modern industrial society. For 20th century mystics, it became a center of spiritual wisdom. For contemporary environmentalists, it's a cautionary tale about technological arrogance. For adventure seekers, it's a source of treasure and ancient artifacts. Each interpretation tells us less about Atlantis itself, which doesn't exist, and more about the concerns and preoccupations of the people doing the interpreting. Atlantis functions as a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting back whatever we're thinking about, whatever we're worried about, whatever we're hoping for. There's also a political dimension to Atlantis belief that's worth examining. In many cases, alternative theories about Atlantis and other ancient mysteries are framed as challenges to establishment authority. Believers position themselves as free thinkers who see truths that orthodox scholars refuse to acknowledge. This creates an appealing narrative of the individual against the system, the brave truth seeker against the hidebound academy. This narrative has particular appeal in societies where trust in institutions is declining, where people feel alienated from expert knowledge, where there's a sense that official sources can't be trusted. If archaeologists and historians are wrong about Atlantis, what else might they be wrong about? If they're suppressing evidence for ancient advanced civilizations, what other truths might they be hiding? Of course, this framing misrepresents how scholarship actually works. Academic knowledge is constantly evolving, based on new evidence and new interpretations. Archaeologists regularly revise their understanding of the past. Consensus changes when evidence warrants it. But the idea of a static, dogmatic establishment refusing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths is more dramatic and emotionally satisfying than the reality of gradual evidence-based knowledge accumulation. The persistence of Atlantis belief despite lack of evidence also tells us something about how people evaluate claims and evidence. Most people, including highly educated people, don't have the specialized knowledge needed to evaluate archaeological or geological claims directly. We rely on expert opinion, on secondary sources, on what seems plausible given our existing knowledge. And here's where things get complicated. A well-written book arguing for Atlantis's reality can seem very convincing to someone without specialized knowledge. The author presents what appears to be evidence, makes arguments that sound logical, points to similarities and patterns that seem significant. Unless you have the background to recognize the selective use of evidence, the logical fallacies, the misunderstandings of chronology or methodology, you might find it persuasive. Moreover, there's a cognitive bias at work called confirmation bias. Once we believe something, we tend to notice and remember evidence that supports our belief while dismissing or forgetting evidence that contradicts it. Someone who's convinced themselves that Atlantis was real will see confirming evidence everywhere. Unusual rock formations become ruins. Geological features become harbors. Any cultural similarity between distant societies becomes evidence of Atlantean influence. The internet age has amplified these tendencies. It's now possible to find communities of like-minded believers for virtually any idea, no matter how fringe. These communities reinforce each other's beliefs, share information that supports their views, and develop elaborate explanations for why mainstream sources disagree with them. The result is belief systems that become increasingly resistant to evidence, increasingly sealed off from contrary information. But I don't want to be too harsh on people who believe in Atlantis or other ancient mysteries, because beneath the factual questions about whether Atlantis existed, there are real and important concerns that these beliefs often gesture toward. Concern about environmental catastrophe and civilization collapse. These are legitimate worries, and there are real historical examples of societies that destroyed their environments and suffered as a result. Concern about lost knowledge. We have lost significant knowledge from past civilizations. Texts burned, traditions forgotten, crafts that vanished with their practitioners. Concern about the arrogance of modern civilization. We are not immune to the hubris that affected our predecessors, and thinking we are is dangerous. The problem isn't the concerns themselves, but the way focusing on mythical Atlantis can distract from genuine issues and real history. The true story of how civilizations rise and fall, how environmental changes affect societies, how knowledge is preserved or lost. These are fascinating and important topics that don't require belief in fictional lost continents. The real archaeological record provides countless examples of societies that faced, and sometimes failed to overcome, environmental challenges, political upheavals, natural catastrophes. The Bronze Age collapse in the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE, when multiple civilizations fell within a few decades, is a genuine historical mystery with profound implications. The abandonment of classic Maya cities in Central America, the decline of Angkor in Cambodia, the fate of the Greenland Norse, the disappearance of the ancestral Puebloans from their cliff dwellings, all of these are real events that demonstrate the fragility of complex societies and deserve serious study. These real historical collapses offer lessons about sustainability, about the importance of environmental management, about how civilizations respond to crisis. They're more relevant to our current challenges than any imaginary Atlantis because they actually happened, because we can trace causes and effects, because we can learn from genuine rather than speculative history. So perhaps the enduring appeal of Atlantis suggests that we need better ways of communicating genuine archaeology and history to the public. We need to make the real past as vivid and engaging as the mythical past. We need to help people understand that the true story of human civilization, with all its triumphs and tragedies, its remarkable achievements and catastrophic failures, is more fascinating than any fiction. And we need to acknowledge that the impulse behind Atlantis fascination, the desire to understand our past, to learn from ancient peoples, to connect with deep human history, is fundamentally healthy. It's the expression that sometimes goes awry, not the underlying curiosity. The real lessons of Atlantis. We've come to the end of our journey through the story of Atlantis.
We've explored Plato's original account, watched the story evolve through 2 millennia, examined proposed locations and archaeological evidence, considered why this tale continues to captivate us. Now, as we prepare to rest and let these ideas settle, let's think about what we can actually learn from Atlantis, not as a lost civilization, but as a story, a myth that has something to teach us. First, and most obviously, Atlantis teaches us about hubris. This was likely Plato's primary intention in creating the story. The Atlanteans started out blessed by the gods, rich in resources, wise and moderate in their behavior. But success bred arrogance. They became greedy, aggressive, convinced of their superiority, determined to conquer and dominate. And for this hubris, this overweening pride and ambition, they were destroyed. This is a timeless lesson. Every age has its own forms of hubris. In our time, we might think about technological arrogance, the belief that we can engineer solutions to every problem without considering consequences. We might think about economic hubris, the conviction that growth can continue forever, that markets will regulate themselves, that we can exploit natural resources without limit. We might think about political hubris, the assumption that our system of government is the only legitimate one, that our values should be universal, that we can remake the world in our image. The lesson of Atlantis isn't that technology or prosperity or power are inherently bad.
The early Atlanteans, in Plato's telling, were virtuous despite their wealth and power. The lesson is that these things become dangerous when they're divorced from wisdom, moderation, and respect for limits. When we start thinking we're invincible, when we stop questioning our own motives and assumptions, when we pursue power for its own sake rather than in service of justice and the common good, we're setting ourselves up for a fall. Second, Atlantis teaches us about the fragility of civilization. Whether or not any specific ancient civilization was destroyed in a single catastrophic event, the broader point stands. Complex societies are vulnerable. They depend on environmental stability, economic interconnections, political legitimacy, cultural cohesion. When these foundations are shaken, collapse can come surprisingly quickly. We've seen this throughout history. Bronze Age civilizations around the Mediterranean fell in rapid succession. Classical Maya cities were abandoned. The Western Roman Empire disintegrated. Every civilization we know of has eventually ended or been transformed beyond recognition. This doesn't mean civilization itself is doomed, but it means we should never take its continuance for granted. We should attend to its foundations, address the stresses that weaken it, and work to make it resilient rather than assuming it will continue automatically. In our era, climate change represents perhaps the most significant threat to civilization stability. Rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, sea level rise, more frequent extreme weather events, all of these will stress the systems that support complex societies. How we respond to these challenges, whether with wisdom or with hubris, may determine whether our civilization follows the path of Plato's virtuous Athens or his corrupted Atlantis. Third, Atlantis teaches us about the power and danger of stories. Plato created a fictional civilization and presented it as history. That story has shaped human thought and behavior for over 2,000 years. It has inspired expeditions, influenced philosophical and spiritual movements, affected how people think about the past, and continues to generate debate and fascination. Stories matter. Narratives shape how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. The myths we tell about our origins, our destiny, our relationship to nature and to each other, these myths influence our actions in profound ways. Plato understood this. He used story not because he was trying to deceive, but because he recognized that narrative could convey truths that abstract argument might miss. But the Atlantis story also shows us the danger when we lose the distinction between myth and history, between allegory and fact. When we treat metaphor as literal truth, when we base decisions on stories rather than evidence,
we can be led astray.
The key is to appreciate the wisdom in myths while recognizing their literary rather than factual nature, to let them inform our thinking without letting them determine our conclusions. Fourth, Atlantis teaches us humility about what we know and don't know. One reason the Atlantis story persists is that we are genuinely ignorant about many aspects of ancient history. We don't know everything about how ancient civilizations developed, interacted, and fell. We're constantly making new archaeological discoveries that revise our understanding. There are real mysteries still to be solved. This should make us humble. The scholar who claims absolute certainty about ancient history is overreaching. There's always room for new evidence, new interpretations, new understandings. At the same time, this doesn't mean all theories are equally valid. Some explanations are better supported by evidence than others. Humility should make us careful in our claims, not credulous about alternatives. The proper stance, I think, is one of openness to new evidence combined with insistence on a rigorous methodology. We should be willing to revise our understanding when good evidence appears, but we should also maintain high standards for what constitutes good evidence. This balance between openness and rigor is essential for genuine knowledge. Fifth, Atlantis teaches us about the importance of critical thinking. The persistence of Atlantis belief, despite lack of evidence, demonstrates how easily even intelligent people can be misled by poor reasoning, selective evidence, and appealing narratives. If we want to understand the world accurately, we need to develop skills of critical analysis. This means learning to recognize logical fallacies, to evaluate evidence quality, to consider alternative explanations, to resist confirmation bias. It means being willing to change our minds when evidence warrants it, even if that means abandoning beliefs we find emotionally satisfying. It means distinguishing between what we want to be true and what the evidence actually supports. These skills are essential not just for evaluating claims about Atlantis, but for navigating our information-rich world more generally. We're constantly bombarded with claims, arguments, alleged facts. Sorting truth from falsehood, good evidence from poor speculation, requires critical thinking skills that can be developed and refined. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Atlantis teaches us about the human need for meaning and connection. The reason this story endures isn't primarily intellectual. It endures because it speaks to something deep in human psychology, the sense that there's more to existence than the mundane surface of daily life, that the past holds secrets and wisdom, that we're part of a larger story stretching back through time. This need is real and legitimate. We are meaning-seeking creatures.
We need to feel connected to something larger than ourselves, to understand our place in the grand sweep of history, to learn from those who came before us. The question is how we fulfill that need, through myth and speculation, or through genuine engagement with the real complexity and depth of human history. My argument throughout this exploration has been that the real past, understood through evidence and scholarship, offers richer material for meaning-making than any fictional Atlantis. The true story of human civilization, how we evolved from small bands of hunter-gatherers to societies of billions, how we developed language, art, technology, philosophy, how we adapted to different environments, how we created and sometimes destroyed, how we've struggled with the perennial questions of justice, meaning, and the good life. This story is profound and significant. We don't need to invent fictional lost civilizations when the real development of human culture is so extraordinary. We don't need to imagine ancient wisdom when we have access to the genuine philosophical and spiritual traditions of many cultures. We don't need myths of paradise lost when we can study the actual triumphs and tragedies of our ancestors. But we do need to make that real history accessible, engaging, meaningful. We need to tell it in ways that capture imagination while respecting evidence. We need to help people understand that rigor and wonder aren't opposites, that the truth can be more fascinating than fiction, that evidence-based knowledge doesn't diminish mystery, but deepens it.
Because here's the thing about the real world, the real past, the genuine complexity of nature and history. It's inexhaustible. No matter how much we learn, there's always more to discover. No matter how much we understand, deeper questions emerge. The universe doesn't become less wondrous when we study it carefully. It becomes more so. The past doesn't become less meaningful when we examine it rigorously. It becomes more relevant. Atlantis, the fictional island, never existed. But Atlantis, the story, the myth, the collective human fascination with lost paradise and recovered wisdom, that exists very much. It exists in our imaginations, our hopes, our fears, our eternal wrestling with questions of meaning and mortality. The challenge is to honor that story, to recognize what it tells us about ourselves, while not mistaking it for history, to let myth inspire us without letting it mislead us, to remain open to mystery while insisting on evidence, to dream of what might have been, while attending to what actually is.
We examined evidence and considered theories. We thought about why this story endures and what it might teach us. The conclusion we've reached, that Atlantis was Plato's invention rather than a historical reality, might disappoint those hoping for definitive proof of a lost civilization. But I hope what we've discovered along the way compensates for that disappointment, because the true history of Atlantis, the story of how this tale has shaped human thought for over 2,000 years, is itself fascinating and significant. We've learned that a well-crafted story can outlive empires, that myth can be as influential as fact, that the human imagination is powerful enough to create entire civilizations from words alone. We've seen how each era reinterprets ancient tales through its own concerns and preoccupations. We've watched scholarship and speculation interact, sometimes productively, sometimes destructively, as people wrestle with fundamental questions about our past and our nature. And we've been reminded that the real world, studied carefully and honestly, offers wonders that no fiction can match. The true story of human civilization, with all its complexity and contradictions, its achievements and failures, its beauty and brutality, is profound enough to occupy our attention and meaningful enough to shape our understanding of who we are and what we might become. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let your mind wander through the images we've encountered. Picture Plato in ancient Athens, writing by lamplight, crafting his philosophical tale. See Bronze Age Crete, its palaces gleaming in Mediterranean sun. Watch volcanic Thera explode, ash rising miles into the sky. Stand with Ignatius Donnelly, surrounded by books and maps, convinced he solved the mystery. Walk through modern libraries where scholars patiently piece together genuine history from fragments and artifacts. And, perhaps most importantly, recognize yourself in this story. You're part of the long human tradition of seeking meaning in the past, of trying to understand where we come from and where we might be going. Your curiosity, your willingness to question and explore, your engagement with these ideas, all of this connects you to centuries of seekers, dreamers, scholars, and storytellers who've pondered the same mysteries. The Atlantis Plato described never existed, but the human impulse that makes us search for it, that makes us hope for ancient wisdom and vanished paradise, that makes us believe there's more to existence than what we see on the surface, that impulse is real and valuable. The challenge is directing it toward truth rather than fantasy, toward evidence rather than speculation, toward the genuine mysteries that surround us rather than the imaginary ones we create. Sleep well, dear listeners. Dream of ancient islands and lost civilizations, if you wish. Let your imagination roam through underwater ruins and forgotten temples.
But when you wake, remember that the real world is waiting, full of actual mysteries to explore, genuine histories to uncover, true wonders to discover. And those real wonders, approached with curiosity and rigor, with imagination tempered by evidence, offer satisfactions that no myth, however beautiful, can provide. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the true history of Atlantis. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your waking hours full of wonder at the genuine complexity and beauty of our shared human past. If you enjoyed this exploration, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Echoes of Etheria for more deep dives into history, mythology, and the stories that shape our understanding of the world. Your support helps me continue creating these long-form, thoughtful explorations of the topics that fascinate us all. Until we meet again in another evening of shared stories and discoveries, take care of yourselves and each other. Good night.